Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for being part of this panel. Let's get right to it, right? The first question that I have is for all three panelists. I want to know, what do you think would be the effect of President Obama's recent visit to Cuba, an island where the Castro brothers have ruled for over 5 decades? What changes can we expect 1 year from today?
Where do you want to start?
Mr. Selesky.
Well, I think it's very positive that he went there. It reinforced the changes and the things that he is trying to put in place in engaging with Cuba. I do believe the timing may not have been the best timing in the world. Obviously there was a considerable amount of focus on Cuban entrepreneurs. His speech, he was very aggressive about in terms of changes, political changes, and how the youth in Cuba needs to change things. And I think given the timing of the Cuban Congress, Communist Party Congress, I think that it kind of boxed Cuba in a little bit in terms of, do we make changes? It looks like we're kind of giving into U.S. demands for liberalization of the economy and everything. So I applaud the trip. I wish it kind of happened maybe a month or two from now instead of when it did.
I thought the president's trip was a dramatic breakthrough and a delivering on a promise that began way back in 2008 when candidate Obama came to Miami and on the campaign trail said that he wanted to take a new approach to Cuba, and after many fits and starts, took us very far in the direction of ending the Cold War in Latin America and finding a new way of having a dialogue and engaging with this historic enemy. And I think the impact is in twofold: one here in the United States, including in Florida, and one in Cuba. In the United States, we're seeing much greater movement toward engagement across all of society and a much greater debate in Congress, which has a key role to play in dealing with the embargo. And then I think an impact in Cuba is harder to measure, but all the initial reports were very positive, and everyone watched it on TV. It was broadcast on radio as well, and many people reported, tears in their eyes about the way he was addressing and talking directly to the Cuban people. And without a policy of direct engagement, you wouldn't have that. So I think that in and of itself changes the whole frame and moves us into a new direction. It might be somewhat unpredictable, but positive.
Mr. Poblet.
Yeah, I think overall I come at it from a different approach in the sense that when we're going to engage in the international arena, especially in the Western Hemisphere, we need to do so focused on American principles of individual liberty, rule of law, property rights. And I think the president got a little bit ahead of all those. I think the trip was beyond premature. I think it was completely uncalled for. I felt it was more of a legacy building tour than a serious policy initiative, because ultimately we have on the books clear transition roadmaps that we need to follow if we're going to engage in this type of activity with the Cuban regime. And in my book, issues such as property claims, Cuba owes billions of dollars to American citizens for property it stole and never paid for. There's an issue, of course, the human rights issue, and all sorts of other indicia that we need to focus on. And ultimately, I see we have 2 embassies, but what did the U.S. taxpayer get from this? Not much.
All right, we're going to get to the next question, and we're going to talk specifically about all these topics. This question is for Mr. Selesky. President Obama's visit to Cuba highlighted the potential for a better relationship between Washington and Havana and the need for a transformation of the island's state-dominated economy. What steps can the United States take to help Cuba develop a fully functioning financial system?
Well, I think the last executive order was very telling in helping Cuba. The biggest problem the Cubans had, the basis of the embargo in Helms-Burton is the use of the U.S. dollar. The Cuban government, Cuban entrepreneurs really were restricted from using the U.S. dollar outside of Cuba. So it's like being a prize fighter and going into a boxing match, having one arm tied behind your back. So that restriction was lifted, and I think that's going to help a great deal. As we know, since 1989, the world is global, and they have to be able to participate in the global economy. So I think that was huge. I also think that, the U.S., by helping Cuban entrepreneurs, now they can do their banking in the U.S. They have a lot more access to capital and so on that they didn't have before, the lifting of the remittances and so on. Many of the new enterprises that are started up in Cuba are really funded out of the United States. People's family members sending money to their family members in Cuba. So I think this is all very positive. We've got a long way to go, but I think we've taken some big steps, and I think the last order really was probably the most important for both the nation as a whole, the Cuban people, as well as Cuban entrepreneurs.
And speaking of the entrepreneurs, this question is for you, Mr. Picon. The private sector in Cuba employs 28% of the workforce. The cuentapropistas are the most vibrant sector of the economy. They are allowed to operate by the government, but they need more than legal permission to operate. They need access to capital. How can the United States help grow the new Cuban private sector?
Well, we heard at an earlier discussion today just the dynamism of this new emerging private sector, whether it's in the accounting field or in the media field, B&Bs and restaurants. So they need all kinds of help. And most dramatically, they are receiving remittances from family in the United States. And that's thanks to the Obama administration, which decided in 2009 to make that much easier and to make family visits easier. And that's the kind of capital that is then being reinvested in this emerging private sector. So we want to see that continue and make it even easier to facilitate the flow of income from monies from the United States. Now, of course, the Cuban government also needs to do a lot more. They need to expand the number of categories that are permitted for entrepreneurial activity, and they need to reduce the tax burden on them and allow them to hire more employees and also allow them access to the wholesale market. And many of the restaurants, for example, have to buy their goods at retail prices, and it gets too expensive. And many of them are coming here to Miami to buy their goods and flying back to Cuba. So there's a lot more that has to be done on both sides.
Thank you. Mr. Zaleski and Mr. Poblete, this question is for both of you. We're going to start with you, Mr. Poblete. The Treasury Department stated in 2015 that it supports small loans for entrepreneurs in Cuba. If the Cuban government allows this, should President Obama lift the remaining restrictions for U.S. banks to operate in Cuba? If so, what immediate impact would this bring to Cuban entrepreneurs?
Well, access to the U.S. market, first of all, and I just want to respond to something we've said here, is a privilege, not a right. And if Cuba wants to engage in the U.S. marketplace, it first needs to seriously engage in two things, political and economic reform. And it's not as if this is something new. U.S. law has been amended several times in '92, in '96, and in 2000. In fact, I would say the embargo has been weakened and paved the way for President Obama to opt to go to Cuba prematurely, but go no less. And when you consider that the annual income that Cuba receives from remittances just about obliterates anything else that they generate in Cuba, you can see how policy has been working. We've been helping the Cuban people for quite some time. Before we go down the road of further easing of sanctions, whether or not the president, by the way, I'm not sure he has the statutory authority to do that. I think that's going to require congressional involvement. I think it's extremely premature to go down that road because, frankly, this is a personal opinion. I don't believe there's a private sector in Cuba. And I advise companies all the time about this to be very careful not to use those terms because they mean very different things here than what they mean in Cuba. So I think we have to be careful with the words here because as it stands, there is no private sector in Cuba. You can't own a company in Cuba. Individuals can't go register an LLC. Individuals can't hire a lawyer to represent them unless you're part of the state or a buró colectivo. There's no independent lawyers in Cuba. So I think there's a lot of different things, indicia of what constitutes a private sector that, frankly, right now don't even merit regulatory review. I think there still needs to be some robust discussion in Congress before we even reach that point.
Mr. Zaleski, how do you feel about this?
Well, I mean, we're at this point now where the embargo in Helms-Burton is like Swiss cheese. So many holes have been poked into it. I mean, that at this point, in my opinion, the embargo just needs to be lifted. I mean, it's proven over 50-some years that this hasn't worked. You know, we have seen a growing private sector. You've got 500,000 people now working not on the government payroll. You can see the difference, the vibrancy that's going on down there. You know, I think we just need to lift the rest of the restrictions and allow the Cuban people to enjoy the global market that's out there, you know. I mean, one thing about Cuba, you know, look, Miami was built by the Cubans for the most part. I mean, look how the entrepreneurial spirit there. You know, the education level of the Cuban people down there, it's incredible. I mean, there is a huge opportunity, and I think at this point, I think the embargo just needs to be lifted, and we just need to let things take their course. Because I do believe that there'll be more privatization, there's going to be more capitalistic things that happen in Cuba. We just got to give it a chance. And it's still with Helms-Burton, there's enough restrictions in there that limit what Cuban entrepreneurs can do. It's still difficult, as well as just being involved in the international market.
Well, why does the onus have to be on the United States to change? The president went to Cuba, and what did the U.S. taxpayer get in return for that exchange? I think the embargo has not failed in the sense that we don't have an embargo policy. We have a policy of isolation of the Cuban government through sanctions, targeted sanctions, that I advise companies on this all the time. And then we have a dual-use focus that the other half of it is support of the Cuban people. That is not an embargo policy. That is a bifurcated, bipartisan process that's worked quite well. And in fact, but for that, we wouldn't have a Cuban civil society today in Cuba. We wouldn't have potential opposition leaders in Cuba. We wouldn't even be talking about a president's trip to Cuba, because I think a lot of this paved the way. The president, however, put the cart before the horse, if you will. And rather than stand with the Cuban people, stand with U.S. taxpayers, he opted to go to Havana and stand next to someone who, as a matter of law, is a war criminal, who's committed genocidal acts against his people. And that's something that the power of the presidency is symbolic, and it's also substantive. And I think you have to be careful when you project power that way, especially for not just Cuba. How we solve Cuba, this is my last point, how we solve Cuba is important, not just for Cuba, but for other countries in the hemisphere, that rule of law is going to be right at the front of the line, respect for property, respect for civil liberties. Why did the president do that?
So I'm trying to understand the argument that Jason's making, because we've had over 50 years of a very comprehensive, punitive embargo that has failed to achieve our stated objectives. There's no question about that. The Castros are still in power, it's still a communist system, and we still see thousands of migrants leaving the island because life is very difficult there. So we have a responsibility, I think, to try to bring Cuba into the 21st century, into a region that's built on democracy and the rule of law. But are we going to say and have such high hurdles? No, we can't until you do this perfect record, report card. That's impossible. I mean, it's just not going to happen. You have to start somewhere. And after so many years of failure where we have become isolated, no other state in the entire United Nations supports the embargo. So you can't have an effective embargo in that situation. So if you're only standing on principle and you're trying to empower the Cuban people, but you're saying, but we're going to keep punishing you until your government improves its performance, how are you helping the Cuban people? You need to engage with them and support them directly, and I think that's what the policy is all about.
You want to add something?
Yeah, I think, first of all, Cuba's been engaging with the rest of the world for quite some time. I mean, the Europeans go down, the Canadians go down, there's a lot of other countries that trade with Cuba. The embargo is not the policy, that's a talking point. The policy has been evolving since the mid-1990s in a bipartisan way to allow for engagement with the people of Cuba, and that's what we have been doing. But engagement without conditioning makes no sense from a foreign policy standpoint, from a national interest standpoint. Cuba is not a very friendly government. Now, we can choose to ignore it. We can choose to ignore that they hide cop killers. We can choose to ignore the atrocious human rights records. I mean, we're talking about a hemisphere where we've tried two leaders, Pinochet and Fujimori, for very serious crimes. Why does this debate on Cuba get second thrift? Why do we treat the criminals that lead this system? And it's a criminal cartel. And I'm not saying this lightly. It's a serious issue, because if U.S. companies are being encouraged to go trade in that market, and you have to deal with compliance issues like the FCPA, like export controls, like sanctions, these are issues that corporate America needs to focus on and do focus on. And I think it behooves us to not be clear about these things. And when the president goes to Cuba and stands next to someone like Raul Castro, I think that does call his integrity and his leadership into question.
Mr. Picon, I have another question for you. These necessary changes, economic changes that we have just talked about, cannot happen unless the Cuban government also takes action, especially because of the lack of financial infrastructure, especially because of the transparent accounting, the lack of, and legal assurances. Is the Cuban government ready and willing to take these steps?
Well, I think I can't answer that on behalf of the Cuban government, but I think they know that they have major challenges ahead of them, and there needs to be serious reform going forward. There's no question about that. And you have a situation in which they have to reform their economic system if they're going to survive, and if they want to protect the gains of the revolution. And those include the economic, social safety nets that they've created over the years that many Cubans have benefited from. So to do that, they have to take a whole series of steps. And they're obviously going too slow. You know, Raul Castro has complained very publicly, including this weekend, about the bureaucrats in his system and how they are not doing their job and they are not fulfilling the goals that the government laid out 5 years ago. So we're seeing at least some self-criticism, but they are not able at this point to move fast enough to really get the critical mass going to deliver changes on the ground. It's happening, it's slow, and the pockets where it is happening are in areas like the private sector, and we need to continue to support them.
Thank you. Now, this question is for Mr. Zaleski. Another important issue is the outstanding property claims by the U.S. Some feel that the resolution of these cases would signal to foreign investors that Cuba is prepared to respect property rights. Can this issue be solved soon, and what does it take to resolve it?
I mean, that's a diplomatic issue, and I think they're talking about it now, and obviously it's being negotiated. But you know, it's very difficult. I mean, you know, how do you figure out what exactly are the claims? I mean, you know, it's been 50-some years. You know, they've got claims on us supposedly due to damages because of the embargo. So, you know, I think it is a major stumbling block to, you know, really having normalized relations. I mean, it needs to be resolved, but I don't see that being resolved in this year, for instance. I think it's a longer-term prospect till that takes place.
So I mean, we can't have negotiations with Cuba unless we have a relationship with them, and now we do, and so we can begin that negotiation process. So that's one good thing about having diplomatic relations with a neighbor. And that involves roughly almost $2 billion worth of claims. There are roughly 6,000 that have been certified by the US government. And they need to be addressed, absolutely. They need to be resolved, and the Cubans know that. The question is how much money is going to be put on the table to get that resolved. I think there are a whole other set of claims that are not fully recognized by either government that will also have to be addressed. And with some creative diplomacy, I think that can happen. It is a condition for lifting the embargo. So if the Cubans want the embargo lifted, they're going to have to deal with this issue.
Here's a good example of what I meant at the onset of this discussion about putting U.S. interests first. The original reasons why the embargo was put in place back in the 60s was this mass confiscation of U.S. property, the largest confiscation of U.S. property, businesses, and homes, probably in modern times. Now, when we went to Burma, we went back into Burma a few years ago. When we went back into Vietnam before that, before the president honored them with a visit, a lot of these issues were negotiated ahead of time. Not before, but ahead of time. We've had relations with Cuba for quite some time. We have secret meetings with them in Guantanamo. We have meetings in Canada. This has been going on during the Bush administration. We have contacts with the Cuban government. So we have the relationship. The property issue could have been talked about. The number that Ted was mentioning, I just want to clarify. We believe the claim figure is at least $8 billion if you add in the interest. Let me ask the business people here. If you're going to go invest in a country, and this is a practical tip, when you engage in Cuba transactions, you need to check that the transactions you're engaging in are not involving property subject to one of these certified claims. That's the law. That's not a spin. That's what the law requires. So it is a serious issue, which again gets to the heart of this discussion that we're having. When are we going to put U.S. taxpayer interests before anybody else's? And that's the struggle of his trip to Cuba. That it was a lot of sound bites, but no substance. And that's not how you have to conduct foreign policy. I call it's the Iran deal of the Western Hemisphere, except that the Iran deal has a kickback provision in the law that if Iran violates sanctions, violates the agreement, the sanctions snap back. But Cuba, after November, there's no guarantee if the Republicans win the White House, for example, and maintain control of Congress, that most of this can be undone. And that's, I think, tragic, because if the president had focused on these equities and not just the property issue, there's some other issues that we have to look at, like labor rights and what have you, could have created a different outcome possibly. But not rewarding a trip, not rewarding the Cuban government with a trip to Cuba by the Commander-in-Chief of the United States of America.
This brings me to my next question, and it's for all three of you. When this election year is over, can the current administration's policy towards Cuba remain unchanged? Mr. Picon, we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, everything the president has done is by executive order through exceptions to the embargo. That means a new president can undo those. I think the issue will be whether, depending on who wins, the progress of change and the benefits of actual having diplomatic relations proves itself a winner. In other words, do we see enough benefit to continuing on the course of engagement with Cuba, or do we want to go back to the past of isolation, punitive sanctions with no results, which is what we had for the first 50 years before this policy?
Mr. Selesky.
The train has left the station. I mean, are you going to go back to American Airlines, Delta, Southwest, Carnival, Starwood, and I can tell you, because we're the only bank that's doing business down there, probably the 100 or 150 Fortune 500 companies that are trying to get into Cuba and say, look, whatever you've spent and whatever you've done, you know, it's too bad, you're out. I just don't see that happening. It's not the way Washington works. I mean, Washington works by, you know, lobbying and by money and by influence, and these companies they want to do business in Cuba, and I think that's what's really going to drive both the sanctions, or the executive orders stay in place, and I think it will also ultimately drive to the embargo being lifted.
About 2 or 3 weeks after President Obama made his December 17, 2014 announcement, a Wall Street Journal reporter was asking me about what I thought about the announcement. This is before any of the regs were issued, way before any of these changes took place, way before we knew a trip was going to happen. And what he took from my interview is exactly how I feel today. And I borrowed 2 words that Alan Greenspan used to describe the 1990 dot-com bubble, the irrational exuberance. It's that was surrounding the investment activity back then. It's the same thing with Cuba. Cuba's a very limited market. Let's keep it in context. It's just 10 million people. The poorest state in the Union, Mississippi, generates more GDP than Cuba has and ever will under communist rule. Miami generates more GDP. So we need to keep that in context. We can undo the regs because some of these regs are unresponsive to the law and unresponsive to the policy that encourages the type of economic activity that we want to see generated and political reform that we want to see generated, just because it hasn't allegedly not worked, and I don't ascribe to that. I believe it has worked, and it's worked remarkably well. I do think we can capture a lot of this and undo it, and if the Congress, and here is where I've been very public about this back in Virginia and DC, I mean, I think the Congress needs to do a better job doing oversight on this issue. I think that there have been Republican and Democrat administrations that haven't done a good enough job of enforcing the law that's on the books to economically isolate the economic activity. If we can do it in the case of Iran, if we could do it in the case of North Korea, we can do it for a tiny island, the biggest one in the Caribbean, albeit 90 miles away from the United States. And there just needs to be a political will to do it. The other side has decided to spend a lot of money to lobby. The bottom line is the Congress has said time and time again, we're not budging on this until these principles in the transition roadmap are met. So they spent millions of dollars the last 2 years, and all they have are 2 embassies. I think that tells you where the political will is right now. And I think we need to refocus this and have a discussion about serious U.S. policy aims that put U.S. taxpayers first.
Just 2 quick points. One is, I don't think Cuba poses the kind of threat to us that, say, Iran or North Korea does in terms of nuclear weapons.
I think it does.
Secondly, I think we also
Not on nuclear
have
weapons,
to think
though.
about the political opinions of the American public. And now it's very clear through all kinds of polling that we've done, bipartisan majorities throughout the country, including among Hispanics, including among Cuban Americans right here in Florida, who support the president's policy, who want to see engagement continue. So I think that'll also be a factor after November in how the Congress and the next president respond to this issue.
All right, thank you so much. My next question is for you, Mr. Picon. The embargo remains in place, and Cuba has done very little to address issues in key areas of human rights. Which next steps can both countries take to make progress?
The human rights issue is by far the hardest and most sensitive issue in the relationship. We have two very different ways of thinking about human rights. The Cuban model is limited to their version of economic and social rights. We're very focused on political and civil rights, and we say you can't really have economic and social development without basic freedom of expression, freedom of association, multi-party elections. I believe deeply in those issues. I've been working on it my entire career. We have to face some realities that what we have tried over all these last years has failed, and we need to try a different approach. And what President Obama did by meeting directly with entrepreneurs, with dissidents and civil society, with journalists, having an ongoing conversation with Juani Sanchez, who was here earlier today, these are the kinds of steps that will open the kind of space in Cuba that will allow freedom to grow.
All right, thank you. Another important issue that we have in terms of Cuba is that the island faces this problem. It has two currencies. Mr. Zaleski, this question is for you. The Cuban peso and el peso convertible, or CUC. The Cuban government says that it is committed to eliminating this confusing system, but according to industry experts, it would require assistance from international financial institutions. What kind of support can the U.S. provide to assist in the transition?
Well, I think that is a number one impediment to the Cuban economy right now. I mean, frankly, there's three currencies. There's the U.S. dollar, too. There's so many transactions are being done outside of Cuba in the U.S. Somebody wants, a family member in Cuba wants to buy a car. Well, the money is transmitted in dollars into a U.S. account. There's no velocity of money, and you're seeing more and more Cubans hoarding dollars. I mean, they're very concerned about, is somebody going to get a haircut, or is somebody going to get, get less than they thought they would with this whole unification of the currency. It's a very difficult matter, but once again, supporting their ability to go to the IMF and things like that should help their ability to get this done. It is a high priority with the Cuban government, and I think ultimately it's the thing that's holding the economy back the most, because I do believe there's so many transactions being done in U.S. dollars and that money is just not flowing through the Cuban economy, and you're getting that velocity that's so important to any economy. So.
This question could be for all of you. One of the main infrastructure problems the private sector in Cuba faces is the lack of access to the internet. Only government officials, journalists, and academics have access to the internet in their homes. What specific steps are being taken to allow better access for the people?
I mean, I can't speak to what the Cubans are doing, but I can speak to and point the audience to an article in Computer Week today, written by a reporter who spent a month in Cuba. And to summarize what he said, he was studying the internet and studying the progress, as alleged progress in internet penetration on the island. And this fellow said, and this is someone who doesn't have a background in U.S.-Cuba policy, he said there is not enough Google pixie dust to change what is needed to change in Cuba about the internet. These are his words, that what's needed in Cuba before any of this is political reform. And I think that says a lot when you have somebody who has not really followed the Cuba issue focused that way. I think we need freedom, we need liberty. If Cubans had the access to the technology, they could have Wi-Fi spots all over the island tomorrow on these devices. I mean, these devices can let you do that type of thing, but Cuba won't allow it. And I think the fact that they haven't tells you that we're going into this process where they even want to control that. They want to censor what Cubans read, what Cubans have access to. And I think that gets to the heart of why this policy of engagement without condition will fail. And I think it's going to lead us down a very difficult path. And my last point is that in U.S. law, it's very clear. Our policy is a peaceful transition to whatever the Cuban people want it to be. And if they opt for a system that does these atrocious things, give them the choice and let them do it. But the fact that we're creating conditions that are going to create tension and not a peaceful transition, I think that's what's frustrating.
So there is an exception to the embargo that allows for telecommunications support and engagement exchange with the United States, because Congress recognized that this is a particularly important way that the United States could be helpful and break the information blockade that the Cuban government has against its own people. So what are we seeing now? We're seeing a very slow spread of internet access and Wi-Fi through hotspots throughout various cities. And you see, when you walk around Havana, where the hotspots are, because there are hundreds of Cubans standing around looking at their phones and talking to their relatives in Miami. This is going to snowball, I think. The demand among the Cuban people is growing, and it's getting higher and higher and harder for the government to resist. So they are now saying that they're going to keep expanding this, this access. It's costly, but I agree with Jason. It's a matter of political will, and the Cuban government needs to get moving on this. We heard earlier this morning from one of the entrepreneurs that there are other ways of getting around this problem. The paquete, which is a flash drive with a terabyte of TVs, movies, news that gets moved around the island. It's a very entrepreneurial activity, and it's one that's being tolerated by the government. So there is, there are some ways of building the flow of information, but a lot more has to be done.
Mr. Zaleski.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, the only thing I would add is, Facebook reported that of the users, of the internet users in Cuba, 85% of them have a Facebook page. I mean, so that just tells you if we can get them access across the board that, they're gonna take advantage of all the different mediums that are out there, whether it's news or social media and so on. So it's very powerful. It's very powerful, and it needs to happen. And I think my guess is that that's going to happen slowly and over time, and that we'll start seeing some improvement in that area.
Yeah, and the good news on this, to end on a high note if we're getting close to the end here, but we've had since 1992 the telecom exception to the embargo. And it's been one of the success stories in that you've been able to use that exception to connect families and be able to get in there and hopefully expand the information systems, because that's what ultimately, I think, helps bring about political change when you have an educated and when the island people know that there's a world out there beyond that Potemkin existence that they have. I think that's a positive thing. They can do a lot more, though. And I think that the president, I've harped this several times, and I think I need to do it again. Google offered them Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi, the entire island. They said no. What are they scared of? The internet? Surfing on the web? I think that tells us that there needs to be a mind shift within the folks at the very top that either we're going to let some of it in, or you're going to keep letting none of it in. And I think the Cuban people are, right now are being kept out of that process. It's a very small percentage of the Cuban people that have access to the internet, just maybe 5%. And that's really in a country of 10 million people, just 90 miles away from the U.S. It's uncalled for.
Thank you. This is the last question for all three of you, and it has to do with the Carnival. Carnival just announced that it would now allow Cuban-born Americans to book their cruises to the island, pending a change in Cuban policy. If not, it will delay its May 1st sailing until all guests can travel. Do you agree with this? Mr. Zaleski.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. Look, I mean, it's an old law that's been in Cuba for a long time, and I'm sure they're gonna change it. But there's plenty of old laws in the U.S. that need to be changed. I mean, it's just one of those things. I don't think Carnival, if they could look back and before they had signed that agreement, I think if they'd known about the law, they would have negotiated that out to start with. And it kind of took off in social media, and it took off in the newspapers as this was a big mistake and everything. I can tell you, Carnival was completely unaware of it, and I don't even think the Cuban government had even thought about it much before it was even signed. So, I'm sure the Cuban government's going to eliminate that law, and Carnival will be cruising, maybe not May 1st, but soon after that.
I agree with Dave on this point. And I think it's symbolic of all these old laws and attitudes that need to change. And this one, we'll see how quickly the Cubans move to change it. It's such an obvious discriminatory practice that should not be accepted. And I think Carnival did the right thing by postponing their trip.
Mr. Poblet, how do you feel about this?
I'm glad that they postponed the trip, and I hope that there's some focus. This is a lesson for all companies, frankly, that are looking at the Cuban market and looking at if you can transact business there under the exceptions to the embargo, the due diligence and the screening that has to happen. That law was, at least I knew about it. It's not one that caught me by surprise. Maybe I follow this a little too closely. But it's important, and I think they had a public relations issue also that they should have thought through a little better. I think when you're in the capital, I guess, of the diaspora, that there's my last point on this, and it touches on the transitional justice issues. There's a lot of healing that's taking place here. It's going to take some time. You just can't erase 57 years of dictatorial rule where people have lost family members and people have been in prison. Some of that's still very raw, and you just can't ignore it. So a lesson here for Carnival, from the Carnival experience, not just on the legal side, but on the PR side, I guess, is that you need to take these folks into account and not just brush them off like if they mean nothing. Those people mean something, and there's a process coming soon of transitional justice, of reconciliation that may or may not happen in a year or two, but it's coming. And this community is going to have to deal with some pretty strong emotions and strong issues that I think every company that engages in that market needs to be sensitive to.
Thank you. We have to wrap this up. Do you have any last thoughts?
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And thank you.
Great job.